The highway stretched ahead like a dark river, trying to swallow everything in its path, rain hammering down with such violence that Malik Torres could barely see 10 feet beyond his windshield, despite the wipers working frantically. Most drivers had pulled over to wait out the storm, their hazard lights blinking desperately along the shoulder like prayers sent up to an indifferent sky. But Malik pushed forward because he had to get home to Zara before exhaustion claimed him completely. He'd just finished a brutal warehouse shift that left his back aching and his hands raw, and tomorrow morning he faced a foreclosure hearing that could take away everything he'd worked 10 years to build.
That's when he saw them, standing in the rain like ghosts materialized from the storm itself. 3 figures beside a silver Mercedes SUV with steam pouring from under the hood. 3 identical teenage girls, maybe 16 or 17. Their expensive clothes plastered to their bodies and offering no protection against the cold that must have seeped into their bones by now. They had no umbrellas, no jackets, just terror written across their faces as his headlights caught them. And even through the rain, Malik could see they'd been out here long enough to lose hope that anyone would stop.
Welcome to Soul Emotional Stories. Please make sure to like and comment where you are watching from.
Every fiber in Malik's exhausted body screamed at him to keep driving because he had his own crisis waiting at home, his own impossible battle starting in less than 12 hours. He had his own daughter who needed him, his own nightmare with consolidated home lending that threatened to destroy a decade of sacrifice and hard work. But his mother's voice cut through the exhaustion and fear with words she'd repeated until they became part of his DNA. When you see someone drowning, and you know how to swim, you don't ask questions. You just dive in and pull them out, because that's what it means to be human in a world that tries to make us forget.
Before we continue, make sure to like and tell me in the comment where you are watching from.
Malik's foot hit the brake, and he pulled onto the shoulder 20 feet ahead of the disabled Mercedes, put his hazards on, and stepped out into rain that hit like a physical assault. He jogged back to where the 3 girls stood huddled together, and up close, he could see they were identical triplets, their faces showing that particular mix of relief and disbelief that comes when rescue arrives after you've given up hope. "You need help?" Malik shouted over thunder that rolled across the sky like drums announcing the end of the world.
The tallest one stepped forward, trying to maintain composure despite shivering so hard her whole body shook with violent tremors. "Our car overheated about 45 minutes ago, and our phones are dead, and nobody will stop. Everyone just keeps driving past like we're invisible." Her voice cracked on the last word, and Malik understood immediately what she meant. These wealthy girls had probably never experienced what it felt like to need help and have the world pretend you didn't exist. "Get in my car," he said, already moving back toward his Honda because standing out here wasted time they didn't have.
They climbed into his 2008 Honda Civic that was held together by hope and determination, and Malik grabbed the emergency blanket from his trunk, the thick one he kept for Zara, and handed it back without hesitation. "Share that and try to warm up while I call your insurance company." His phone showed 18% battery, but he got through to a dispatcher and arranged everything with precision. Exact mile marker, vehicle description, 3 stranded minors needing immediate assistance. The girls watched him handle the crisis with efficiency that seemed to surprise them, like they'd never seen someone solve problems without money or connections.
"Tow truck will be here in 90 minutes, Malik said, pulling carefully back onto the highway with his worn tires struggling for grip on the wet asphalt. "There's a Comfort Inn about 12 miles up the road. I'll get you there so you can get warm and charge your phones and call your parents, who are probably losing their minds with worry right now." The drive was mostly silent, except for the rain drumming on the roof and the struggling heater that barely worked. But gradually, the girls stopped shivering quite so violently as warmth returned to their bodies.
The Comfort Inn sign appeared through the rain like salvation rendered in neon, and Malik pulled into the parking lot and helped them into the lobby, where the night clerk's expression immediately turned suspicious at the sight of 3 wet teenage girls and an exhausted man in work clothes. "We need a room," the leader said, reaching for her wallet only to realize her cards were in her phone case and her phone was dead and useless. Malik saw the clerk's suspicion deepening into something uglier, saw where this was going, and pulled out his own credit card, the one with exactly $87 of available credit, money he'd saved for Zara's field trip. "1 room, put it on this." The transaction went through and wiped out his available credit completely, but the girls were safe, and that's what mattered. "Thank you," one whispered with tears in her eyes. "What's your name?" Malik was already turning to leave, already thinking about tomorrow's hearing and Judge Caldwell, and the impossibility of winning against a system designed to protect banks over people. "Malik Torres, but you don't owe me anything. Just be safe and call your parents." As his taillights disappeared into the storm, 3 girls stood in the hotel lobby, holding a secret they didn't yet understand.
What would you do if helping strangers meant using the last money you had for your own child? Malik drove through the rain toward home with his mind cycling back through 10 years of sacrifice that had led him to this impossible moment. 10 years of working himself to exhaustion to keep the promise he'd made when Zara was born. The house on Maple Street had been a foreclosure property when he'd found it, a 3-bedroom ranch labeled Zara's Future on his banking app. The mortgage payment was $1,847 per month, and for 10 years he'd never missed it. Not once, not even close, because that house represented everything he'd never had growing up in foster care, bouncing between homes that never wanted him permanently. He'd set up automatic payments through direct debit, so there was no possibility of forgetting or making mistakes, and he'd built a small emergency fund to cover any gaps between paychecks from his 3 jobs. The warehouse paid the bulk of his income, but the hours were unpredictable, so he'd added weekend stocking at Morrison's Grocery and delivery driving through an app that let him work whenever Zara was asleep or with Mrs. Chen. Everything had been working perfectly until September 15th, when his delivery app payment got delayed by a platform processing error that put his deposit 6 hours behind schedule. The mortgage company tried to pull the automatic payment at 3 a.m. like always, but the money hit his account at 9 a.m., and in those 6 hours, everything changed. Malik discovered the failed payment when he checked his account at lunch and immediately transferred money from his emergency savings to cover it, paying the full amount by 5 p.m. that same day, 38 hours after the scheduled payment time. He'd thought that would be the end of it, just a minor technical hiccup that he'd resolved quickly and responsibly, like he resolved everything in his carefully constructed life. But 2 weeks later, a letter arrived from Consolidated Home Lending with Vanessa Hargrove's signature at the bottom, informing him that he was delinquent on his mortgage and owed $2,300 in late fees, processing charges, administrative costs, and legal preparation fees. $2,300 for being 38 hours late on a payment he'd made 10 years of on-time payments before this single error that wasn't even really his fault. Before we continue, make sure to like and tell me in the comment where you are watching from. Malik had called immediately, explaining the situation to customer service representatives who read from scripts and told him the fees were contractually valid according to the terms he'd agreed to when signing the mortgage documents. He'd asked to speak to supervisors who said the same thing with slightly more authority in their voices. He'd sent emails documenting everything, the platform delay, his immediate response, his decade of perfect payment history, but every response came back with the same message. The contract allowed these fees, and he was required to pay them within 30 days or face foreclosure proceedings. 30 days to find $2,300 on top of his regular mortgage payment and all his other expenses. 30 days while working 3 jobs that barely covered his existing bills and left him running on 4 hours of sleep most nights. He tried taking extra delivery shifts, but the app limited how many hours he could work in a week for driver safety reasons that really just meant they didn't want to pay benefits. He'd asked for overtime at the warehouse, but his supervisor said they were cutting hours due to economic uncertainty, even though the company had just reported record profits. He looked into personal loans, but his credit wasn't good enough for reasonable interest rates, and payday lenders wanted fees that would trap him in a cycle he'd never escape. The 30 days had passed, while he scrambled and calculated and lost sleep trying to find money that didn't exist. And then the foreclosure notice arrived, with a court date and Vanessa Hargrove's name, and the cold legal language that said Consolidated Home Lending was moving to take his house. The house where Zara had learned to walk, where she'd lost her first tooth, where every wall held memories of bedtime stories and birthday parties and the life he'd built from nothing. 10 years of mortgage payments totaling over $220,000 paid faithfully every single month, and now they wanted to take it all because of one 38-hour delay,
and fees he couldn't pay.
Malik pulled into his driveway at 2:15 a.m. and sat in the car for a moment, looking at the house that represented everything he'd worked for and everything he stood to lose. The gutters needed cleaning and the paint was fading, and the front steps had a crack he kept meaning to fix. But it was theirs, his and Zara's, and the thought of some bank taking it and selling it to someone else made his chest feel like it was being crushed in a vice. Tomorrow morning at 9 a.m., he'd stand before Judge Preston Caldwell, a man known for ruling in favor of financial institutions, and he tried to explain why one mistake shouldn't erase 10 years of responsibility. Inside, Mrs. Chen had left a note saying Zara had gone to bed at 8:30 after finishing her homework and eating the dinner Mrs. Chen had made for her. Malik checked on his daughter, found her sleeping peacefully with her stuffed elephant clutched against her chest, and felt his throat tighten with the fear that he might not be able to protect her from what was coming. She believed her daddy could fix anything, believed the world made sense and hard work got rewarded and good people didn't lose their homes. And tomorrow might be the day that innocent faith got shattered. What would you do if 10 years of hard work could be erased by one technical error and a system designed to profit from your mistakes? All rise. Judge Preston Caldwell entered and sat without looking at anyone in the courtroom, his face showing nothing but cold authority that seemed to fill every corner of the space like ice spreading across a winter lake. The bailiff's voice cut through the tense silence with formal precision. Case number 2024-FC-18847, Consolidated Home Lending versus Malik Torres, foreclosure proceedings. Malik stood with his hands shaking despite his best efforts to appear calm and composed, clutching the manila folder that contained 10 years of payment records and proof that he'd covered the missed direct debit within 38 hours of discovering the platform error. His substitute attorney Patterson stood beside him, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else, coffee stains visible on his tie and sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool courtroom temperature. Rodriguez had called that morning from a hospital bed, saying he'd been in a car accident and was sending Patterson as emergency replacement, which meant Malik's representation consisted of a nervous lawyer who'd received the case file 40 minutes ago. Caldwell's eyes swept across the courtroom in a cold assessment that seemed to categorize and dismiss everyone present before his gaze finally settled on the mortgage company's attorney. Before we continue, make sure to like and tell me in the comment where you are watching from.
Mr. Whitmore, present your case. Duncan Whitmore stood smoothly in a suit that probably cost more than Malik's monthly mortgage payment, his movements practiced and confident, like someone who'd done this hundreds of times and knew exactly how it would end. Your Honor, the facts are straightforward and undisputed. Mr. Torres's direct debit payment failed on September 15th due to insufficient funds in his account, and while he did eventually pay 38 hours later, this constitutes clear payment delinquency under the terms of the mortgage agreement he signed 10 years ago. He now owes contractually valid late fees, processing charges, and legal costs totaling $2,300, and despite multiple written notices over the past 60 days, he has failed to pay these accumulated fees. The words hit Malik like physical blows because they were technically accurate, even though they stripped away all context and humanity from the situation. Yes, the payment had failed. Yes, he owed fees he couldn't pay. Yes, he hadn't responded adequately to their notices. But Whitmore made it sound like irresponsibility and bad character, when the truth was a platform processing delay and a financial system designed to trap people in impossible situations. Mr. Torres has demonstrated an inability to meet his financial obligations as outlined in the mortgage contract, and Consolidated Home Lending respectfully requests that foreclosure proceedings move forward to protect its legitimate business interests and recover the property that serves as collateral for this delinquent loan. Mr. Patterson, your response. Caldwell's voice carried no warmth, no indication that he cared about anything beyond the legal mechanics of the case before him. Patterson stood and fumbled with papers that kept trying to escape his nervous hands, his voice wavering as he attempted to present a defense he'd barely had time to understand. Your Honor, my client paid the missed mortgage payment within 38 hours, and he's been current on all subsequent payments since then.
So one technical error caused by circumstances beyond his control shouldn't result in losing a home he's paid faithfully on for 10 years without a single previous late payment.
One technical error that violates the mortgage agreement your client signed, Caldwell said with a tone that suggested he'd heard variations of this argument countless times and found it unconvincing every single time. Mr. Patterson, does your client dispute that the September payment was late? Patterson's face went pale as he realized he was already losing ground he couldn't afford to give up. No, Your Honor, but the circumstances of the platform delay. Caldwell cut him off with surgical precision. Does he dispute that the late fees are outlined in the mortgage contract as valid charges for payment delinquency?
The fees are excessive and arguably predatory, Your Honor. $2,300 for 38 hours represents... Patterson's voice gained slight confidence as he tried to pivot to the fee argument, but Caldwell interrupted again. Mr. Patterson, I asked if your client disputes that these fees are outlined in the contract he signed when he took out this mortgage 10 years ago. The silence that followed felt crushing, and Patterson's shoulders slumped with visible defeat. No, Your Honor, the fees are in the contract, but we're arguing they're unconscionable given... Another interruption, this time with an edge of impatience.
Your Honor, Malik's voice cut through the legal back and forth, powered by desperation and the absolute refusal to let lawyers and judges decide his daughter's fate without hearing directly from him. I paid that mortgage within 38 hours of discovering the delay, and in 10 years I've never been late once, not a single payment missed or delayed until a platform processing error that was completely beyond my control caused this situation. One mistake in a decade of responsibility shouldn't cost my daughter her home, especially when I have documentation proving I acted immediately to correct it the moment I discovered the problem.
Mr. Torres. Caldwell's eyes locked onto Malik with an intensity that made the temperature seem to drop, his voice carrying a warning that was both professional and personal. You will speak only when directly addressed by this court, and I will not repeat this instruction. The courtroom held its breath in a moment that stretched impossibly long, everyone waiting to see if this desperate homeowner would dare push back against a judge who clearly didn't tolerate defiance or disruption. Malik met Caldwell's gaze without looking away, and something flickered across the judge's face too quickly to identify. Surprise, maybe, or recognition of something he hadn't expected to see. However, the single word hung in the courtroom air like an unexpected lifeline, and Malik felt his heart hammering against his ribs hard enough to hurt. I will review your complete 10-year payment history and the fee assessment structure that Consolidated Home Lending has applied in this case, and you have until Friday morning to present comprehensive documentation, not emotional appeals, Mr. Torres, but concrete evidence supporting your position regarding these fees and your overall payment record. The gavel slammed down with finality that echoed off the wood-paneled walls.
This hearing is continued until Friday at 9 a.m. sharp, and I strongly suggest you use these 3 days wisely to prepare a proper legal argument. Caldwell stood and exited through the chamber doors before anyone could respond, leaving the courtroom in stunned silence. Malik stood frozen, trying to process what had just happened. 3 more days, 3 more chances to find some way to prove his case, 3 more days before everything collapsed. His phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Chin asking how it went, and his fingers felt numb typing back 3 words that felt like both hope and torture. 3 more days. What would you do if you had 72 hours to prove that one mistake shouldn't erase 10 years of doing everything right?
Mr. Torres, wait. Judge Caldwell's voice cut through the noise of the courtroom clearing out, stopping Malik in his tracks as he reached for the heavy wooden doors that led to freedom and 3 days of desperate preparation. The bailiff had called out instructions for everyone to exit efficiently. Lawyers were packing briefcases with practice speed, and Vanessa Hargrove was already on her phone, probably discussing her next foreclosure victim. But the judge's voice carried an authority that made everyone pause and turn, including Whitmore, who looked surprised that Caldwell wanted additional conversation with the defendant in a case that seemed straightforward.
Malik turned back slowly, his heart hammering with fear that maybe the judge had changed his mind. Maybe those 3 days were being revoked. Maybe this was where everything fell apart completely. Patterson stood beside him, looking equally confused and nervous, his hand hovering near Malik's elbow, like he might need to physically support his client through whatever came next.
Mr. Torres, please approach the bench. Alone, Caldwell added with emphasis that made Patterson step back reluctantly, and Malik walked forward on legs that felt disconnected from his body, each step echoing in the nearly empty courtroom.
Before we continue, make sure to like and tell me in the comment where you are watching from.
Caldwell waited until everyone else had filed out, and the courtroom doors had closed with a heavy thud that seemed to seal them in a space suddenly intimate and charged with tension Malik couldn't identify. The judge's expression had changed subtly. The cold authority was still there, but something else showed through now, something that looked almost like conflict or uncertainty. Mr. Torres, I need to tell you something that has no bearing on the legal merits of your case, but which I cannot in good conscience leave unspoken, Caldwell began, his voice lower now, more personal.
Malik stood frozen, having no idea what was coming, but feeling the weight of this moment pressing down on his shoulders like physical force. Last night, my 3 daughters were stranded on the highway in a storm. Their car had overheated, and their phones were dead, and they were scared and alone in conditions that could have turned dangerous very quickly. Caldwell's voice carried emotion now, real human feeling breaking through the judicial mask he'd worn throughout the hearing. They stood in that rain for 45 minutes while dozens of cars passed them by, and then a stranger stopped. The world tilted sideways, and Malik felt his breath catch in his throat as understanding crashed over him like a wave. That stranger called their insurance company, drove them to a hotel, paid for their room with his own money, even though they were complete strangers and he had no obligation to help them. Caldwell's eyes were locked on Malik's face now, watching his reaction with an intensity that felt like being X-rayed. My daughters told me this morning about the man who saved them when no one else would, and they described him in detail, his car, his kindness, his name. Those 3 girls you helped last night, Mr. Torres Siena, Autumn and Haven, they're my daughters, and you saved them when I couldn't be there to protect them myself. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that Malik's exhausted brain struggled to process. The judge, the man who held his future in his hands, the man known as the guillotine, who ruled against homeowners 94% of the time, was the father of the girls he'd rescued. The universe had created a connection so unlikely it felt like fiction, like some cosmic joke or test that Malik couldn't begin to understand. I want you to know that this changes nothing about the legal proceedings. I'm bound by law and judicial ethics to rule based solely on the evidence and applicable statutes, not on personal gratitude or emotional considerations. But I also want you to know that my daughters came home last night talking about a stranger who showed them genuine compassion when he had every reason to drive past them, and they described you as someone who gave them the last money you had, without expecting anything in return. Malik found his voice finally, though it came out rough with emotion he'd been holding back for hours. I didn't know they were your daughters, Your Honor. I just saw 3 kids who needed help in a storm. The simplicity of the statement seemed to hit Caldwell with unexpected force, and the judge nodded slowly, like Malik had just confirmed something important. I know you didn't know, which makes what you did even more meaningful. You helped strangers because it was the right thing to do, not because you thought it would benefit you somehow. My daughters are safe because of your character, Mr. Torres, and I'm telling you this because, regardless of how I rule on Friday, you deserve to know that your kindness mattered, and that I see you as more than just a case number on my docket. Caldwell's voice carried something that might have been respect, or admiration, or the painful recognition that his judicial assumptions might not match reality. Use these 3 days well, and know that when I review your case, I'll be looking at the evidence with eyes that understand you're a man who stops to help strangers, even when you're facing your own crisis. The judge stood and exited through his private chamber door, leaving Malik standing alone in the empty courtroom trying to process what had just happened. The girls he'd saved were Caldwell's daughters, and the judge knew it. And somehow that knowledge hung in the air like a promise or a threat, or maybe just a statement of truth that changed everything and nothing simultaneously. Malik's phone buzzed with another text from Mrs. Chen, but he couldn't focus enough to read it because his mind was spinning through implications and possibilities and the terrifying hope that maybe, just maybe, doing the right thing for strangers in a storm might save his daughter's home.
What would you do if the person whose mercy you needed turned out to be someone you'd already shown mercy to without knowing it?
Friday morning arrived with winter sunlight streaming through the courtroom windows. 3 days having passed in a blur of document preparation and sleepless nights, and Mrs. Chen watching Zara while Malik put together every piece of evidence he could find. He'd organized his 10 years of payment records into a folder so comprehensive it made Patterson's eyes widen when he saw it. Every single on-time payment, documented with bank statements and confirmation numbers that proved his reliability. He'd also researched consolidated home lending and found online complaints from 17 other homeowners describing similar situations. One missed payment, followed by excessive fees and immediate foreclosure proceedings that seemed designed to trap people in impossible situations. The courtroom filled with the same players as Tuesday. Whitmore looking confident, Hargrove scrolling her phone with the same indifference. Patterson now slightly more prepared after 3 days to actually study the case. But something felt different in the air, some shift in energy that Malik couldn't quite identify as he stood clutching his folder and trying to control the fear that threatened to overwhelm him. "All rise," the bailiff announced, and Judge Caldwell entered with the same measured steps, but his face showed something subtly different. Not warmth exactly, but a kind of focused attention that suggested he'd spent these 3 days actually thinking about this case instead of just processing it like routine paperwork. Before we continue, make sure to like and tell me in the comment where you are watching from. Mr. Torres, I've reviewed your complete payment history, and the record shows that in 10 years you've never been late on a mortgage payment until September 15th of this year, when a platform processing delay caused your direct debit to fail. Caldwell's voice carried across the courtroom with authority, but also something that sounded almost like respect, or at least acknowledgement of facts that mattered. I've also reviewed the fee structure that Consolidated Home Lending applied to your account, and I have significant concerns about whether these fees represent a good faith attempt to recover actual costs, or whether they constitute a punitive measure designed to create additional profit from a minor technical violation. Whitmore stood quickly, his confidence cracking slightly at the judge's unexpected line of questioning. "Your Honor, the fees are clearly outlined in the mortgage contract that Mr. Torres signed, and they represent our company's legitimate costs for processing late payments and initiating legal proceedings." But Caldwell cut him off with a look that could freeze water. "Mr. Whitmore, $2,300 for 38 hours of payment delay does not represent legitimate cost recovery. It represents predatory lending practices that target vulnerable homeowners and trap them in spirals of debt that serve your company's profit margins rather than any legitimate business purpose." The courtroom went absolutely silent, and Malik felt his heart hammering so hard he thought everyone must be able to hear it. After reviewing the evidence and considering the totality of circumstances, this court finds that Mr. Torres has demonstrated 10 years of exemplary payment history, and that the September delay was caused by circumstances beyond his control that he remedied within 38 hours. Caldwell's voice grew stronger, more confident, like he'd found solid ground after days of wrestling with difficult questions. Furthermore, this court finds that the fee structure applied by Consolidated Home Lending is excessive, unconscionable, and likely violates state consumer protection statutes regarding unfair lending practices. Therefore, I am ruling that the foreclosure proceedings are dismissed with prejudice. Mr. Torres' payment record is restored to good standing, and Consolidated Home Lending is ordered to refund any fees collected and remove all negative reporting from his credit history. The gavel came down with a sound that felt like thunder and salvation combined, and Malik's knees nearly buckled with relief, so intense it hurt. Furthermore, I am referring this case to the State Attorney General's Office for investigation into Consolidated Home Lending's fee practices, and I will be recommending to the state legislature that they consider regulatory reform to prevent mortgage servicers from using minor technical violations as opportunities for predatory profit-taking.
Caldwell looked directly at Malik, and something passed between them. Acknowledgement of what had happened on that highway. Recognition that justice and mercy had somehow aligned in a way that felt both earned and given. Mr. Torres, your home is yours, and you've earned it through a decade of responsibility that one platform delay couldn't erase. Malik felt tears burning his eyes but didn't try to hide them, didn't care who saw, 'cause Zara would have her home, and he'd fought the system and somehow, impossibly, he'd won.
The courtroom erupted in chaos. Patterson pumping his fist, Hargrove arguing furiously with Whitmore, observers who'd been watching murmuring with surprise and approval. But Malik just stood there, feeling like he could finally breathe after days of suffocating pressure, feeling like the universe had bent toward justice for once instead of crushing him under its weight. He thought about the storm and the 3 girls and the $87 he'd spent without knowing it would lead to this moment. And he understood that sometimes doing the right thing creates ripples you can't predict or control. As he left the courtroom, Patterson slapped his shoulder with genuine joy, and Mrs. Chin texted that Zara was asking if they could celebrate with ice cream. Malik typed back yes and added 17 emojis that his daughter had taught him to use, his hands still shaking, but this time from relief instead of fear. Outside the courthouse, winter sun felt warm on his face, and he stood for a moment just breathing and existing, and knowing that he'd saved his daughter's home, not through luck, but through 10 years of responsibility and 1 night of compassion that had created a connection nobody could have predicted. Judge Caldwell watched from his chamber window as Malik Torres walked down the courthouse steps, looking like a man who'd been given his life back. And he thought about his daughter's words 3 nights ago, describing the stranger who'd helped them. He didn't hesitate, Dad. He just stopped and helped like it was the most natural thing in the world. The judge had built a career on cold analysis and strict contract interpretation, but maybe, just maybe, there was room for recognizing that humanity and justice weren't always in opposition. He picked up his phone and called his legislative contacts, beginning the process of pushing for mortgage lending reform that would protect other homeowners from the predatory practices he'd seen in Torres's case. 10 years of hard work had been validated by 3 days of justice, and a storm that brought strangers together had created changes that would ripple forward in ways none of them could fully predict. Malik Torres drove home to tell his daughter they were safe. Judge Caldwell began drafting reform proposals, and somewhere in the machinery of the legal system, the gears were shifting towards something that looked almost like fairness. The universe had brought them together for a reason, and they'd both done what needed doing when the moment demanded it. Malik by stopping to help strangers in a storm, and Caldwell by recognizing that sometimes the letter of the law needs to bend toward the spirit of justice. What would you change if you had the power to fix a broken system that profits from other people's misfortune?